Am I sharing my left or my right screen here? Dennis, you see my email?
Yes, I see the city. Yes.
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Safety Academy. As always, quick reminder, you get these emails. That's why everybody's here today. There's some important information on here. One is Dennis's email if you have any questions. He's our coordinator. The other is the link to the Tampa Bay Traffic Safety Local Area Traffic Safety Academy webpage. Clicking on that link takes you right to the website where information about upcoming webinars are posted, as well as the presentations and videos from the prior webinars are here in these document libraries. Down at the bottom, there's also links for your PDH request forms. You do get 1 hour of professional development if you're a professional engineer. So this is the location to go to for all of that, and the link is provided in the email that you receive as your notes.
Your page is not up. All I see is the city right now.
Oh, you see it's the city. I'm sorry. It's on. Yeah, I was showing the other screen. Well, real quick again.
Yeah.
This email is in the email that you receive, and here's the link for more information. Visit. Clicking on that takes you to the Safety Academy webpage, and all the information that I mentioned is here. This is where the upcoming webinars are and where the information is for the presentations as well as the PDH request form. You'll note also that the PDH request form is posted as a resource on this webinar, so you can download it directly from GoToWebinar. With that, I'll hand it over to Dennis for his intro.
All right. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we see your presentation.
Okay. Good morning. This is Dennis Falloon, the District 7 Safety Academy coordinator and consultant, and I want to welcome you to the 4th District 7 Safety Academy webinar for 2016. Today's safety webinar topic covers using volunteer cycling and running data, which is called STRAVA, to make road safe and more convenient for cyclists. This will be presented by Sean Davis, FDOT Safety Office, Tallahassee, and Dwayne Carver, AICP certified, and also at FDOT Safety Office, Tallahassee. Just to point out, Sean Davis specializes in the integration of geographic and tabular data in pursuit of FDOT's goal of fatality-free transportation system, and Dwayne is the statewide bicycle pedestrian coordinator. With that, I want to just give you a brief introduction to the Safety Academy. And just 1 second from the beginning. As I mentioned earlier, this is the District 7 Local Agency Traffic Safety Academy. And the main purpose of it is to provide webinars that provide safety-related topics to enhance local safety programs. And I've mentioned this before for those that have attended previously. This began in January. You can see the date. The webinars begin around 10 o'clock and they end by 12. They're normally an hour, hour and a half. The asterisk on the one December 14, 2016 is still not sure. The date may be earlier than that we have our last one. So I'll keep you posted if you go to the web page that Anthony showed you previously. Then also there's a link here for registration, and the same link Anthony showed you about going to the district safety web page. And I have a little error there because today is using volunteer cycling and running data, STRAVA, to make roads safe and more convenient for cyclists, not the City of Tampa roundabouts. And then you'll see that we have scheduled webinars for the 13th of April, May 11th, June 8th, all the way out to July 13th. And I've got some other ones being finalized, so I just wanted to let you know that. Also, these sessions are being submitted for AICP, CM credit, and those people that are certified know that they were to go for that information. As I mentioned previously, there's some other topics being finalized. Also, if you're interested as a professional engineer, this is the information and the link that you would go to get the appropriate form to fill out and send it to Larry Hagan for the credit for this webinar. And with, this is my information. If you need me, you can call me, email me, or whatever you need, and I'll be glad to answer your questions. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Sean and Dwayne.
Great. Good morning. We did just want to say thank you to the team in District 7 for inviting us, Matt Weaver and all the folks down there for having us this morning, and we're excited to talk to you all about STRAVA. My name is Sean Davis.
Dwayne Carter.
And as Dennis said, we're both with the DOT. We'll go ahead and jump right in. So we're going to cover three main parts of STRAVA and talking about it. We're going to talk about how you can access the data, some of the data characteristics, and then talk about use cases and how it can be applied to be used in safety, but also throughout the whole transportation system. So I'll turn it over to Dwayne real quick.
Okay. Well, the question we get lots of, well, what is STRAVA anyway? STRAVA is an app that you can get for your smartphone, and what it does, it allows you to track your distance that you've ridden a bike or that you've run, and it's popular with folks who are training for fitness, and it collects information about that, and then it can also do things like estimate your heart rate, how many calories you burned, and things like that. And there are several apps out there that do this, in fact. Map My Ride is another kind of similar one. The neat thing about STRAVA is that they were able to go in and strip out all the identifying characteristics from their data and then turn around and offer it to folks who wanted to use it, like the Department of Transportation, to try to make life better for cyclists and pedestrians by giving us information that we don't currently have on who is where, how many cyclists we have in which locations, how many runners we have in which locations. So that's what the app is for, is really to help folks with their fitness, and we're using it in this way as a kind of a volunteer data collection thing. And as Sean will talk about, if you go into it, you can actually opt out of this system if you don't want to have it collecting your information. But most folks, you know, seem to be happy to do that. And so what we recognize is that with STRAVA, you're not getting a, you know, it's not a random sample of the population. You're getting folks who've self-selected to use this. So you might expect STRAVA users maybe to be more fit than other people because they're exercising. But it is a portion of the folks who are actually on the road who are bicycling and using the system. So that's important to understand. We're going to talk more about what the limitations of the data are, but that's what the program is and what it's designed to do. There's other ways to get information. You can have in-person surveys, which are good because those allow you to do many different sites. You can also target segments of the population for in-person surveys. And if you have permanent count sites as well, you can get everybody who passes by that permanent count site. So we look at STRAVA as one piece of a larger data puzzle, if you will. And our kind of position is if you don't have any data at all, then when you get some data, that's good to have. Even if it's not everything, it's a piece of the puzzle and helps you hopefully understand it better. And ideally, as we get further into this, we'll be able to use STRAVA to help calibrate some of these other items and vice versa and understand the STRAVA data better by correlating it with the in-person surveys and the count sites. Maybe the next slide. Okay. So our target audience is folks who run and bike. Folks who are already self-selecting to use it are generally fitness people who are doing it for fitness. However, you know, we'd like everyone to use it, even if you're just a commuter, even if you utility cyclists, basically anyone out on a bicycle. If they download and use the app, then that's collecting data that will eventually come back to us and help us figure out where people are bicycling and get an idea how many people are bicycling there. And that, in turn, as we'll show you, can help us figure out what kind of facilities would work best. And so I'm going to let Sean talk about some of the nuts and bolts of this thing, because you really need to understand some of that part of it in order to use it effectively. So, Sean, you want to?
So we'll first talk about how you can get access to the data, and we'll talk about some of the licensing and other restrictions. So who is it available to? It's available to any government. So that's state or local, so cities or counties, also MPOs have access to the data. And consultants and contractors working for those folks, so long as they have a valid contract, can get access to the data. Universities can get access as well, but it needs to be in connection with some DOT-specific business or something along those lines. There's two ways you can get access to the data. If you just want to know what it looks like and look at it generally, the STRAVA heat map, and you can just Google that term and it'll come up real quick. That's a quick and easy way, something that Dwayne uses. It doesn't tell you exact numbers, but it tells you relative within a specific area how many folks are using that road. Again, it's just a quick, easy way to get access to the data. If you want access to the full data, again, you can use the DOT's Unified Base Map repository. And there's two different links. If you work for the DOT, you use that link at the top. And then for consultants and contractors and local governments, you have to use that link at the bottom. So we'll go through some of the mechanics of how you get access to the data because it is a little bit complicated, unfortunately. So when you go, for the external folks, when you go to the Unified Base Map repository, so this is the non-DOT folks. If you're within DOT, you go to that link and it should open up automatically. You'll go to the page and you'll see this, and there's a little login button at the bottom. So even if you don't have an account, you have to click login. Then you'll see this screen, and if you already have an account, you can log in. But if you don't, you would need to click that button where it says create a new subscriber account. You'll go to this screen and enter your email address. You have to find your domain. So if you're at alachuacounty.us, you would put whatever your email address and then the name of your website. If it's not in there, you have to send an email to that little button up there to the UBR admin to get it added. And as you're when you're creating a new account, you'll go through the whole process, and then you'll get this error screen that looks like something went wrong. It's not really something going wrong. It's just that we, on the administrative side, have to go in and grant you access to the system. So when you get to this screen, just click the button and send an email to that address at the bottom saying, hey, I need to have my account authorized. So again, that's for folks outside of the DOT. Some of the legal requirements. The first and most important part is that this data is proprietary. STRAVA is a private business, and they not only are they interested in protecting the privacy of their users, but they're also interested in protecting their business. And one of the big things is that we don't want to let the cat out of the bag for how many users they have in the state, because that's again, the data is proprietary, and that's their business. But because the data is proprietary, it is exempt from public records disclosure. So if somebody wrote the DOT or wrote your agency and said, hey, and they're not authorized to have access under the license and they wanted access to the data, we don't have to release the information. We've worked with our DOT legal office to get a statement exempting this information from public records disclosure. We are working with STRAVA and internally to develop some public products, so similar to the STRAVA heat map, some other information that would give you a little bit more fine-grained information but still be okay under our license. Again, accessing the data, if you're outside the agency, it does require accepting a user agreement, and you would need to consult with your agency or with your legal office on how exactly you would go through that, because you're agreeing to uphold the terms and conditions of that license. And if you do download the data, you can't pass it on again to another person. You have to come and access it originally from the DOT. With each of the files, and we'll talk about the files in a little bit, there is metadata which contains all this information about the user agreement and the legal requirements and the public records disclosure. And anything you do has to have that little line at the bottom where it says data license from STRAVA, and that's a part of our user agreement. But we've worked with STRAVA and clarified and found out that We can release the number of people or the number of trips that are on particular segments, so there's no need to hide that information. We can release that as part of reports or publications or presentations, things like that. It's just the number of users in the state that we have to protect. So talking about the data, again, sort of getting into the nuts and bolts, the products that are available, we release summaries of the data. So the data in its raw format gives us a count of users and a count of trips on a particular street segment or a particular intersection, minute by minute. And what we release are summaries. So we'll release summaries for a particular calendar year or a month or the weekdays in that month or the weekends during that month. And then there's also seasonal. And the seasonal, we'll talk about that in a little bit. But again, the raw data is available. We're a bit more protective of that. We're not going to just release that data, but it's helpful data and helpful information when you want to take a look at a particular street segment at a particular time of day. So again, it's down to the minute. So it allows us a lot of fine-grained analysis. But the general information we release are summaries. And for the origin-destination data, we do have trip level. And we'll talk about the OD data a little bit later. So when we talk about the data, it's referenced to something called nav streets. It's also known as NavTech. And it basically has a street segment or a line segment for every street in the state. It's very comprehensive. This data is also available through the Unified Base Map Repository. And what STRAVA does is the way they collect the information is when someone is using their phone, they take a position per second. So they say at this second, you're at this location, kind of like a Hansel and Gretel approach. And so what they do is they look around that street segment and say, okay, how many trips occurred during this minute on this day in this year? And again, that's how we get the base data, but it's referenced back to this street network. And the reason I talk about this street network is because there is some information in there that's helpful. The street name, the functional classification, and again, that doesn't line up with what you would expect with DOT or FHWA. The travel direction on that particular roadway, if it's a divided roadway. The speed category, which is just a general speed, not a specific one, whether it's urban and rural and whether it's divided or undivided. So again, that helps in some of the safety analysis and other analysis that you're able to do. Again, this is a licensed product, so in addition to upholding the terms and conditions of the STRAVA data, you have to comply with the NavTech terms and conditions as well. So actually talking about the data and looking at what we have, this is using the most current complete year that we have. So in 2015, there was close to 1 million activities, and this is in the ride mode. So again, there's run and ride. So these are cyclists, folks who have identified their activities as cycling. Again, there was close to 1 million activities. 14% of those were commute trips across the whole state. Again, an average or a median trip length of 19 miles and about an hour and a half is the median trip. Again, those are medians and not everything in the entire data set, but it gives you an idea. Then also looking at the graph, this gives you an age breakdown by gender. So one of the interesting things I thought was there's actually more, based on this, for the females, they have a higher representation in the 25 to 34 age group. There's not more of them, but in that particular gender, they're higher in the 25 to 34. Again, you can see for both of them the bulk is between 25 and 54. Same thing for the run data. There's less data there, only about 500,000 activities, and as you would expect, a shorter trip length and a shorter trip time. But again, the distribution is close to the same as with the ride, but you get a bigger drop-off when you go to the above 55 category. So when you get the files, there's going to be all these terms associated with it. So when we talk about edges, we're talking about street segments, nodes or intersections. Roll-ups are summaries, and then we talk about seasons. Again, the default that we've gotten from Strava so far is April 1st through October 1. That may hold true for a lot of the continental U.S. and the rest of the U.S., but Florida obviously is a bit different because folks tend to be riding more in the fall and winter than in the summertime. Then when you get the data, you'll have all these field names. So you'll have different acronyms like ATH is athlete, ACT is activities or trips. Sometimes you'll have an R or an A in front of a particular name, and that'll refer to the digitized direction and how much volume was going a particular direction on a particular roadway. Total, count, CNT is count, and then you have commutes. Then you have these underscores, which represent time periods. So you can look at the data and say, and we'll look at this in a little bit, how many trips were in the morning peak period, how many trips were in the afternoon peak period, or what direction were they going. So it allows a fair bit of fine-grained analysis just using the summary data. As I talked about before, Strava is doing a better job of trying to identify commute trips, and there's two different ways that they can identify that. If a person has a trip, and I don't have the specifics on how they define this, but if it's a point-to-point trip instead of a circular trip, they'll generally identify that as a commute trip. Also, the user can go into the app and click this little button at the bottom that says, yes, this was a commute. So they're doing a better job of trying to identify these commute trips. So what does the data look like? So what we have here is looking at bike volume. So where you have those pink routes is where you have more higher use on those particular roadways, and where you have the blue is lower use. And all the black dots are crashes. So I haven't had a chance to look at the crash data against the Strava data. You know, you may be able to say there's more crashes where there's lower volume, but we need to do some more research, and we need to do some more work to be able to actually confidently say that. I mean, generally looking at it, you do have what appears to be more bike crashes in those blue areas, but then you still have, at least over here on the east side, and this is in Dade County, over on US 1, you still have a fair number of crashes over there. So it's hard to, at least at this point, to look at it definitively and say, where there's low volume, there's more bike crashes. We're just not confident and sure of that yet. We need to do more research. Looking at the sample data, again, we'll use Dade County, the ride data, and we've been using a lot of the ride data because it's a lot easier to apply. It's a lot easier to use. So looking at the ride data in 2014, for the entire county, there were 29 million trips on 166 segments, and that's not 29 million unique trips, but when you add up the trips on all the segments, it adds up to about 29 million. So it averages out to about 180 trips per segment. The biggest one is on Rickenbacker Causeway. They had 24,000 Strava trips alone in 2014. The number of users, again, this is all information that we can release publicly. There's about 44 users per segment, and again, Rickenbacker Causeway had the most in 2014 with about 2,400 users on that particular segment for the entire year. If you aren't aware, Rickenbacker Causeway is down on the southern part of Dade County, and it goes between Virginia Key and the Brickell area in downtown Miami. Like I was talking about before, you can look at use by time of day. So in this picture where you have the yellow segments, that's trips that occurred in 2014 during the morning peak time, so from 5 to 10 a.m. The green ones are the PM peak, the afternoon peak, and then the red ones are the late night. So you can see over on Virginia Key, on that little key over on the east side, and on Rickenbacker Causeway going up to the mainland, it's a heavily used segment or heavily used area in the morning. When you go out to the western part of the county, you're starting to get more use in the afternoon. And then you even see a couple segments in the middle and in other areas, the red segments, where they've got a lot of use after 8 o'clock at night. Not knowing a lot about Dade County, I'm not sure why that's occurring. And then all the blue ones, there's not a real definite pattern on those ones. But again, this is a way you can use the data to look at what's the characteristic of a particular roadway for this segment. When are they using that roadway? Again, I talked about the node data or the intersection data. You can look at both counts, so how many folks are passing through a particular intersection, and then you can take a look at the time spent at an intersection. I've been looking at that data lately. There's not a whole lot of variation in it, so I'm still trying to figure out how we would use it. But again, it's another measure, another piece of data that we get from STRAVA. Another interesting one is looking at origin and destination data. So the data is referenced to census block groups, and it is at the trip level. So that's why they're using census block groups, because STRAVA wants to protect their users' privacy, and they don't want to say person A went from this exact location to this exact location. So that's why they give us information reference to census block groups. Again, those green lines are showing trips going towards downtown Miami in the morning and where those trips started based on the census block groups. And then the red lines are showing outbound trips. So when folks left downtown Miami in the afternoon peak, where did they go to? Again, that is, we have trip level information, and it gives it to us in origin and destination polygons, and then it tells us a path as well, what polygons those folks went through. Another way to look at the origin and destination data is we can look at flow. So on the left-hand side, you have morning peak. So where you have green, you added users, and where you have purple, you lost users. So you can see between the afternoon and the morning and the afternoon, the image is basically flipped. But it's interesting because it tells you where people are going from and where they're going to, and you could do further analysis in those the areas over in Virginia Key and on the west end of the county, and try and figure out when people are leaving here in the afternoon, where are they going to. So again, just another way to help better understand when folks are commuting, where they're going from and where they're going to. We were talking about before about digitized direction. So in a GIS, lines are drawn in a particular direction, which is indicated by those arrows on the screen. So in this case, both those lines, and this is a divided roadway, this is US 1 down in Dade County. Both those lines were drawn in the same direction, but you can see the number of trips either with or against the digitized direction. So it tells you which way people are going on that segment. So if you want to think about it, on the top line, they're going, or 67 trips going eastbound, or sorry, 85 trips going eastbound, and 67 trips going westbound. And then on the bottom segment, you get the reverse. You get 62 going westbound and 38 going eastbound. And one caveat on this information is, in Strava, they're not using your exact, they're not using GPS quality information. They're using your cell phone signal, so they're triangulating your position from potentially three different cell phone towers, and trying to determine your latitude and longitude. It's the same thing that Google Maps and all the other apps use when they give you your location. But if you have an area where you don't have a clear, or you have a blocked line of path or line of sight to those cell towers, like under trees or in urban canyons, in between tall condos and buildings, that cell phone signal quality and the position quality can go down. So in some cases, the positions, and you can see it on the screen there, they can jump around at times. Sometimes that cell phone signal quality isn't real great. So you have to keep that in mind when you're using the data. And going back to our previous slide, if the road is relatively narrow, it may be difficult to say that there were exactly 67 trips going against traffic on that side of the road, because the dots may jump around on that road. So it's, when you look at the digitized direction and trips either with or against the digitized direction, you have to keep that in mind, that it's not, they're using good quality GPS locations, but it's not, there can be variations and there can be problems with that data. And it doesn't allow us to say, well, someone was on a sidewalk or they were on the left side of the road or the right side of the road. I think that would be going too far with the data. I'll turn it over to Dwayne to talk about some of the use cases for the data.
Okay. We started thinking about this when Sean got to digging into how they collect this information and looking at what he just shared with you about some of the issues with overlap and exactly how precise you can be about where locations are. And what we're kind of coming to the conclusion is that STRAVA is very good for telling you, for instance, there were X number of cyclists on a roadway segment probably at a given time. When you start digging deeper than that, then we're kind of thinking of it in terms of STRAVA gives you some ideas about things you may want to investigate further. So, for instance, in the example he was just using, where it appeared to show that there were a lot of cycling against traffic. Well, we know that's a safety issue, but we don't know if it's really as big an issue as the STRAVA is indicating. On the other hand, if you have roadways that are similar and one seems to indicate more of that than the other, then that might be something to investigate further. So when you are thinking about where to put out your scarce resources for manual counts and for some of your automated fixed counts and things like this, you could use STRAVA as one of the ways to help you determine that. Another thing is looking at the heat maps. The heat maps won't necessarily tell you for sure we had X number of cyclists, but they can tell you this road was carrying more cyclists than the road next to it, or this was carrying more cyclists than all the other roads in the neighborhood. That's really the kind of information that we want to know anyway. That may be more useful sometimes than knowing the exact number of cyclists. If you want to know exact number of cyclists, you can go deeper into the STRAVA data and pull that, and then you can also go out and schedule your manual counts in those locations. So what this does then, when you get the manual counts, is you can start working backwards and estimating, okay, I know that my STRAVA trips, for instance, are 5% of my actual counted bike trips in this location. So if I have other STRAVA trips in this location, I might assume that those are also representing 5% of the actual trips in that area. And quite often for planning, that's sufficient for us to know what we need to know. And then if we need to go deeper with that, we can always do more manual counts. I like to kind of compare it to the way we do automobile data counts. You can go online and do on the DOT's website and pull down traffic counts for most states or most roads in the state. But if you're doing a traffic study, or you're building a Walmart or getting ready to widen a road or something, you're not going to rely necessarily just on those counts. You'll probably have an engineer go out and do actual counts for you in those locations. It's a similar kind of thing. STRAVA is giving you some general ideas about what counts are, and we'll get more specific with those over time. And we have actually Chris Francis in the room here with us, and they're kicking off a program to develop a statewide bike ped data collection system, and that will allow us to have things like calibration factors and that sort of specificity. Using STRAVA, we can begin to estimate and extrapolate a little further out as what the counts are on different roads, even where we haven't done a manual count system. So that's kind of the way to look at this. It can also help us identify route choices. We've had situations, I've been presented as the state bike ped coordinator. As you're probably aware, shared lane markings are sometimes used on roadways. We don't require them to be used. We give a list of circumstances where they should be considered. And I've had bike ped coordinators call and say, I got this roadway project coming up, it's a resurfacing, and I'm not sure if I should do shared lane markings or not there. Is there a way we can determine if anybody's even using this road for bicycling? Well, the heat maps are very good for that. What we discovered in one situation was that of all the roads in town, the one that was being used most for bicycling was in fact the road that DOT was working on. So I think they decided to go ahead and install shared lane markings there. That was just information we didn't have a year ago, and now we begin to have this information, and we can use it to make hopefully more intelligent decisions about what we're doing. We also find it interesting to look at the route characteristics. Early on, Sean was showing me how, I forget where the city was exactly, but basically the STRAVA data indicated that it appeared cyclists were avoiding our state road like the plague, and they were actually going to the local roads every chance they could. And we had very few bicycle trips on the state road, and they were all on the local streets. Well, if that's your local streets and your state road in your district, you might want to go look and see what the differences are between those and see if you can figure out what kinds of things are making one road more attractive or less attractive. And understanding those route characteristics can help us figure out what types of facilities might actually be better. And we've talked a little bit already about some of the safety analysis that goes into that. And the thing I want to say about safety is that we're on this, we have this Bicycle Pedestrian Safety Coalition that we've been running now for several years, and that has, what, like 5 or 6 different subcommittees, Sean. They're working on that, from engineering and communications and outreach and legal reform, and one of those is data. And it's a very important group because it generates a lot of information that all the other groups use. But it is one out of 5 or 6 other groups that are working toward a solution to the safety issue. STRAVA is one of many ways to look at our data issue, and the data itself only gives us one piece of what we know to solve the whole safety problem. So just kind of keeping that in perspective, I think of it, STRAVA, as a way to maybe help us use our data in a smarter and more effective way, and that can help us with the safety analysis as well. But again, we want to be wise in our decisions about how much emphasis we put on one type of analysis versus another, and I think it's always good to cross-check things. Sean was talking earlier about, well, it looks like we have fewer crashes on roads that have greater bicycling and more crashes on roads that have less bicycling. Does that mean that more bicycling makes it safer, or does it just mean that cyclists are smart enough to avoid unsafe places because they know that crashes happen there? The data might lead you to further investigation. I don't know how often it's actually going to answer the question by itself for you. Sometimes it will, but a lot of times I think it's going to lead you on. Next slide. This is just an example of looking at this in terms of activity count, and you can see in this one the blue indicates more trips and the pink is fewer trips. This is the kind of information that would be useful if you were planning roadway projects or doing a corridor study or trying to decide what types of bike facilities. You could look at this, for instance, and use it as one thing that might help you consider which roads to prioritize for additional attention for bicycle facilities or additional planning. Again, it wouldn't be the only thing, but I would certainly want to start with this kind of information to see if it led me in the direction of knowing which way to go with my programming my scarce resources. Next, please. Okay. Talk a little about when you're actually estimating the bike trips, one of the things you need to use STRAVA most effectively is you really need to have a field count to start with so that you have something to base your calibration on. Then you can use the field counts to kind of calibrate the STRAVA data. So you have a field count for a particular time period in a particular location, then you'll know this is what's going on in the real world. And then you can compare that to what your STRAVA trips tell you is going on there in the STRAVA world. And then you have a way to translate kind of back and forth. There's some limitations on this, and I want to show you in just a moment. Let's say, for instance, you do a study in 1 year, and then you come back 2 years later and discover that the STRAVA trips have doubled. Well, does that mean your actual bicycle usage has doubled, or does it just mean that twice as many people are using STRAVA as were using them 2 years ago? That could be something that could confound your estimate, so be aware of that. Another danger is to extrapolate a little too far. If I have STRAVA counts and I know they account for, say, 5% of the trips on a particular road at a particular location, how safe am I extrapolating that same 5% to all the other roads in the area? Maybe the adjacent roads might be okay, but what if it's a road 2 miles away? I don't know if that's such a good extrapolation or not. So be careful not to go outside your data. And remember that with STRAVA, we are really looking at a fairly small sample size, which is why I think it's quite dangerous to go too deeply into all the numbers that we have that indicate, for instance, that's really unique trip characteristics. We just really don't have a level of precision in the number of accounts to let us know that. So I wouldn't get too deep into saying, well, Strava indicates that we have 50% of our cyclists are riding the wrong way against traffic, for instance, or that they are blowing through this intersection. It's not. We're not really at the level that we can say that kind of information based on the size of the sample size and the limitations on the data. Next slide, please. This is just an example of observed bike trips versus what the Strava was telling us. This slide's a little complicated. I'll try to walk you through it. On the vertical axis is actually, that's what the Strava data was showing us. And on the bottom is the field counts. These field counts are done in District 4. One was on A1A at Hillsborough Inlet. That's the bright green. And then in black, you can see A1A at north of Palmetto Park Road. And two different sets of counts for 2012 and 2013. And it seems to indicate that the bicycle traffic increased in those areas. And in some situations it did, but you see there may also be a little bit of just more folks using Strava there. But you can also see in those that you're getting Strava counts are matching about between 2.5% to 5% of your actual real world counts, observed bike trips. And that is a pretty common number nationwide, is what we're being told, and it seems to match up. As in most places, you're going to find Strava accounts for between 2 and 5% of your observed counts. Next slide, please. Okay. This also indicates this is for Rickenbacker Causeway. If you look at the top graph, it looks like, wow, the bike trips on that causeway have really picked up. In fact, they didn't grow quite by that much. We think this is probably also a situation where more folks are just using Strava. So understanding, you might use this kind of information, for instance, to calibrate against other trips you've done. So if you know in your whole city the Strava counts have increased, and yet you know in a few locations it's based purely on market growth, maybe that market growth applies to your whole city. That's something to think about as you're determining how much weight to give that information. Sean, is there anything else you want to point out about this slide?
Yeah, I think the important thing to remember is, and indications from Strava, is that their user base is doubling every year. So that's really what you're seeing here is 1.5 to 2.5 times growth each year. And the actual, like Dwayne was saying, the actual volume on that particular stretch of road may not have changed, but in the Strava world, it's gone from 20 to 30 trips per day to 50 to 60 trips per day to 100 to 150 trips per day. Again, the volume may not have changed on that roadway. It's just Strava is increasing their user base day by day.
And to me, this also kind of shows that you're always going to need to continue to do your manual counts and your observed counts, and we'll need to do more of them, do them better, and that's what Chris's project is going to help us figure out a more effective and consistent way to do that. But there's so many streets that we're just never going to have counts on. And to me, the power of the Strava information is not that it's ever going to replace those other counts. It's that we now have some information on streets where we had no information before. How many times have you worked with someone who said on a project, well, I don't think anybody even bicycles out here? I'm always surprised when I go in and look at the heat maps to see almost every road has had some kind of bicycle traffic on it. And what that's really telling us in a I think a pretty powerful way is that cyclists go everywhere. They don't confine themselves to particular streets necessarily. They go where they need to go just like the rest of us, and almost any street out there is likely to have some bicycle traffic on it. That's an important thing to understand, especially for people who don't bicycle very much or at all. And Strava can help us get to that information. We wanted to share this with you so you didn't, we don't overuse Strava. I think there's a danger in thinking it's going to be everything to everyone, and then they're going to find out it's not, and they're going to say, oh, well, it's useless. Well, that's not useless at all, but we want to be careful to use it for the right things. All these factors that we're showing you, we're showing you because we want you to be able to calibrate and understand what you're looking at and know to use it in the most effective way, and not try to use it for something that really is not going to work very well for.
Yeah, and I think the last point on this is you have to understand Strava, again, is that relative measure. So within any particular period, whether it's a month or a year or a season, it's going to tell you one road from another. Where's this the cycling community preferring to ride? Yeah. Anything else?
No, that's good. Thanks.
So some of the data cleaning and limitations. Again, we talked about the limitations, the user base. It is a portion of the population. We fully recognize that this is not all bike trips. And again, that cell phone signal quality, you got to be real careful in saying someone was on a sidewalk or where exactly they were on that particular roadway. When we provide the data to you, we do some cleaning. We remove trips on limited access facilities. That's one thing that is in there in the data that we get. And that happens because people forget to turn their tracker off, or they forget to hit some button, and it tracks their use on that particular roadway. We recognize that bikes and runners are not going 70 miles an hour down I-95, so we remove those trips because we recognize that they're not invalid. Another thing we do is we remove those run commutes because I think we recognize that for running, folks aren't really commuting by and large. And with that,
the chat. I was going to say there's a question in the chat. If you can go back to the graph real quick, there's an anomaly around 828. They're wondering if you have any indication as to what that may be.
I do not. I spent a little bit of time, pardon me, trying to figure out what those dips were, and I can't figure out why there are those 1, 2, 3 dips at those 3 locations. I can't figure out why that's happening. Maybe the bridge is shut down, but it's not a complete dip in the numbers. So it may be something in the data. I don't know. I have to go back and do a little more research on why that's there. But yeah, I did notice that as well.
Okay, thanks.
And then the last slide, there are some trainings that we've done in the past. When we got the data delivery, STRAVA, one of the representatives from STRAVA came down and spent about 3 hours with us going over the data. So those top 3, actually all of these are on YouTube. And the PowerPoint presentation is available, I guess, Anthony, through your website, and you can get access to all of these. And we also did another training back in November that you can watch again. But I think those ones from Strava are really good. And I think that's it. We can go ahead and take questions.
Yeah, in the chat at the moment, there are no questions. We'll give folks a few minutes to synthesize the info and see if they have anything anything further that they would like to add. Seems like there's a lot of value to this data. I like it. I need to get my hands on it and play around with it because we deal with crash data a lot here in the Oliver, and just having cycling data to, more or less normalize, not exactly, but more or less normalize that data against it, I think may yield interesting results.
Yeah. I think we're definitely interested in finding out more about how folks are using the data and making it available.
I always want to know, we typically look at our crash rates now, based, for instance, on 100,000 population, and Florida looks pretty bad that way. But we've long speculated whether that's just because we have more people bicycling and walking, and we don't, but there's no way to know that. This begins to give us a peek at that. Now, what we now need is for all other states to get this Strava data as well, so we can compare these numbers to each other. Even if we knew it for Florida, we still don't know how we can compare to other states on that measurement. So we're to get some traction on that as well. And I think it's important because it may help us make sure that we're solving the right problem. If we don't know why, if we're not really measuring a problem the right way, what are the odds we're going to find the right solution to it? And so I'm less interested in knowing necessarily our crash rate per 100,000 population than knowing how many crashes we have, say, per 100,000 cyclists or bicycle travel or something like this. Strava can begin to move us in that direction.
Yeah, The volume information for the cycling and for the pedestrians, for that matter, has always been, in a way, the holy grail in order to be able to normalize the data. I know that, I mean, particularly here in Tampa, and in Pinellas County and Pasco, US 19, and Gulf Boulevard and all these roads, they get a lot of bad rep for the number of bicycle and pedestrian crashes that we have. But I mean, it's nice. Almost every day of the year, people are out on their bicycles. So being able to, it's a matter of exposure to the data, and it's I hope when we get this information that we can actually correlate that and show that it's not necessarily more dangerous. It's just that there's a lot more exposure because there's more cyclists. So the rate would actually be lower. Cynically, you can look at the crash modification factors for providing bike lane out of the clearinghouse when you're doing benefit cost calculations, and there are some crash modifications that installing bicycle lanes actually increases the bicycle crashes. And you look at that and like, well, that doesn't make any sense, but it does, because if a road presently has no sidewalk and no bicycle lanes, you're not going to have a whole lot of cyclists on that road. But the second that you make it friendlier, you make it a more complete street, and you add bicycle lanes, you add sidewalks, all of a sudden your exposure goes through the roof. You have bicyclists on the road where you did not have any before. So the number of bicycle crashes increases, although it is safer for bicyclists on that road than it used to be. So it's always been tricky to look at it by just the frequency of bicycle crashes. It goes up, but yeah, we're doing a lot of things to make it safer for cyclists as well, even though crashes are going up. So it's a balance.
Well, and I don't necessarily think it lets anybody off the hook for solving safety problems, even if we know it's related to higher exposure levels. I'll give you an example. In another district, it's not District 7, we had some complaints about the bike facilities along this road. People were uncomfortable with the bike facilities along this road, and we went and looked at it and said, well, it's a terrible road for bicycling. The shoulders are in terrible condition. There's all these driveway cuts and things, and it's almost impossible to keep it in good condition because there are so many people who want to shoulder into the driveway. But that's where everyone wanted to ride. Well, if we find out, say using STRAVA, and I think we would because of the conditions and the geography of the area, that this is the road that everyone rides on, and it actually has more bicycle traffic than all other roads, even though it's a terrible road. To me, that gives us the impetus to maybe go ahead and find a real solution to that problem. Rather than just add a 4-foot bike lane, maybe we need some other intensive intervention there. And if we know that and can spend more money on that road and maybe spend less money on another place because the STRAVA data and maybe accompanied by other counts tell us that that's just not as important for bicycling, to me that's a good trade-off, and that's a smart way to use the money and a smart way to use this information.
So we have a few comments in the chat. I don't know if you're able to see them on your end by expanding the questions box, but
Sure.
There's a question about are there any plans for the DOT to incorporate the MyMap ride data and some of the other data sources as well? I mean, why STRAVA only right now? Is it just This is the initial phases?
And that's a great question. When we went out to bid for this, we did make it broad enough and we had some indication that Map My Ride, which is owned by Under Armour, that they wanted to provide us data. But when the bids were due, we only got a response from STRAVA. So we are certainly open to using any and all data that we can get our hands on. But STRAVA's the only one, at least at this point, that's in a position to provide a product in a format that we can use. And they're the only ones that provided us a bid. So we're certainly not, we're invested in STRAVA, but we're not dedicated to them. We're definitely interested if Map My Ride wants to come and sell us data, we're interested in that as well.
Great. For consultants working on bike pedestrian safety plans for MPOs, they want to know if they're able to get access to STRAVA data through DOT.
Yeah, we would just need to know who the project manager is at that MPO and the contract number. Once we have that information and verify that it's still valid, then yeah, we can go ahead and authorize access for consultants.
Okay. There's a question about multimodal. In Miami-Dade County, some of the data could somewhat be impacted by mode. For example, someone in South Dade riding their bike, getting on Metroplan, going to downtown, and then completing their journey on a bike. Can you comment on that? How was that? Did you see any of that in your data?
It's difficult to find. So the way we may be able to find that is through the origin destination data. But it's difficult to know because all we're getting is where they started and where they ended and the path they went through. We don't, for the origin destination, we don't see speed. I mean, you could do a calculation over the distance and say that's way too fast. Within the app itself, that person could start and end their trip, so they could ride their bike to the train station, log that as one trip, turn off the tracker, and then when they get off the train, start another trip. So that's two ways that they could do it.
I'm wondering if we would be able to, the same way we eliminated limited access facilities, if we saw that there were STRAVA trips that were on
Metro Rail,
on Metro Rail, that you might eliminate those. For bus trips, though, I think it would be very difficult because let's say we're using a bike on bus systems. Buses actually run at an average speed of about 12 miles an hour, which is the same speed that a cyclist rides. I think it would be hard to tell from the STRAVA data whether you were on a bus or whether you were bicycling. So if someone was using that, and you'd be at on the same street network, so that would be more difficult. Maybe for the trains, you could weed out some of that information. Yeah. But on a bus, it would be more difficult.
Right. It depends on whether we have a street segment for that particular train track, and if it's different, and if it goes to different locations. And I'm not familiar with the Metro Rail in that area and exactly where it goes. And we do look at some of that. We look at what's the average speed on a particular segment to try and make sure that we're not getting crazy numbers. You know, bikes going 50 miles an hour, and we found some of that originally, and Strava worked with us to correct their process to filter some of those out. But yeah, it would depend. I mean, like I said, you'd have to look at the origin destination data.
What? And that's just someone that turned on the app and got in their car and started driving, or how do you get the 50 mile an hour outlier?
Yeah, the 50 mile an hour outliers can be from someone that forgot to turn the app off. There were other issues going on that may have been causing that, like I said, Strava seemed to have fixed for us.
One of them, as I recall, was that sometimes you're dealing with fairly short trip segments or segment links, and you remember what we said earlier about how kind of fuzzy the data is, exactly where we're getting it. So depending on that, you might do the math on the speed and come up with a weird number, but it's really just reflecting the fact that you had a short trip distance, you didn't have much data to start with, and then you're not really sure where it began and ended because of the fact that the data, the kind of the circle of certainty associated with the cell phone coverage is so big that you may run there. So there are several ways that can creep in, but you could sort it out by going back and looking at the speed.
Sure, the GPS on your phone is sometimes plus or minus some large distance. Right. So it could calculate all that wrong. Interesting.
Potentially, yeah.
It may not even be the GPS.
Right, and so again, I think train stations and things like that are going to be a lot easier to use because you know, you could look at that origin destination data and look at the census block groups and find out where are they going to at the train stations, or where are the train stations located.
We're excited to see what you want to do with this.
Yeah, this is certainly still a learning process, and we welcome any input and collaboration. We're here to help.
Yeah, we're hoping people will take some of this and run with it to do some of the things you're talking about.
Yeah, no, and you guys are definitely knowledgeable about the data. You can hear that you're excited about this stuff in your presentation when you're talking about it. We've been talking about crash rates and doing things like this. Is there a standard methodology that anybody's come up with for calculating those, the crash rates, using exposures and? I
mean, if you had if you had actual counts, potentially, yes, you could. I mean, you would just do the number of crashes over the volume just like you would a vehicular crash rate. Using STRAVA, I'm not aware of a methodology. I mean, the closest you might get to is like and you wouldn't have a rate, it would be like a high, medium, low. I don't know. We haven't explored that, but that's a good idea.
I'd be curious to take the Strava data and come up with not seasonal, but what's it called? Like location factors, comparing it to the volumes. You know, like what percentage of a volume, if you have a count, it just shows up on the Strava data. Is it 10%? Is it 20%? Is it 30%? I'm sure that it's going to vary wildly depending on the area. If you're near a trail, the Strava data is going to have a higher percentage of the locations where you're not near a trail. So it would be interesting in a locality to do some bicycle counts where you have strong Strava data and then come up with some factors where you can, within a certain distance of that area, use the Strava data effectively as your count with a factor built into it.
Yeah, and I think when you look at this slide, I mean, you get a wide gamut of use. I mean, everywhere from, and this is older data, so again, remember their market penetration is going, they're picking up a lot more users. You know, it's going anywhere from less than 1% of the total trips to, you know, over 10%. So it depends. Again, it goes back to your market and what roads they're choosing to use. And I think this is having field counts to correlate the data against, and that's one thing I'm definitely willing to help with. If you have a field count, I would be glad to let you know for that particular location over those hours or those days when that count occurred, what the Strava counts were exactly. I'd be happy to provide that information for you.
Well, and I'd like to kind of toss it back to maybe some of you on the phone here, on the presentation. You know, a lot of times for automobile crash modification factors and things like that, they track it back to AADT, and that seems to be a good number. So you have so many crashes per so many trips. We can also look at bicycle crashes in terms of, and it would be more useful to me than knowing per 100,000 population, how many crashes do I have per, you know, average annual bicycle trips. But what about also looking at trip lengths for so many million miles of bicycle travel? That would also be useful to know. How much of that, Sean, do you think we can pull out of Strava data, assuming the data were reasonably clean and that we were reasonably comfortable with the calibrations that we had and all that was?
Right. So, I mean, we could look on a particular roadway and say, I mean, we know the count, we know the length, and so we could get the bike ADT on that trip, on that roadway. We could get the bike VMT or BMT, the bike miles traveled on that particular roadway. We have some data things going on in our office that will allow us to do that for both state and local routes. And that'll probably come online later on this year. That'll help us do some of those calculations. So looking at state roads, what's the bike ADT on this state road or the bike VMT on this state road?
That would be really cool. Does anybody else on the call have any ideas about that?
You're definitely including the local roads in that as well, not just the state data? Correct.
Yeah, we have in the safety office, we have our all roads base map, which has a local linear referencing system for everything that's not a parking lot or private roadway. So that would allow us to chain roadways together and calculate those rates.
Are you still using the Tel Atlas layer, or you have something newer?
We're using NavTech, which is owned by HERE, which is what this data is referenced to.
Oh, I need to get that layer from you. I have a Tel Atlas layer that I use for a linear referencing off system. Yeah, because I mean we'll see with the off system information. I mean, certainly what this data allows you to do is, at the very least, like you were saying, high volume, low volume, medium volume. At the very least, know where to go count and where to do your studies, and you can big picture, looking at the system, you can big picture identify locations of interest. You know, if that location is on system or off system, which I imagine that there's a number of off system locations that have higher frequency of cycle usage because the vehicular volumes tend to be lower. I mean, we have a couple of avid cyclists in our firm, and they commute to the office every day, and it's on the local roads to get to downtown. They don't go on the main roads just because there's less cars. And, it's less exposure for them. It feels safer. So, justifying or prioritizing safety improvements on the local roads based on the volumes is another use for the data.
Sure.
Yeah, and going back to this slide, I mean, it may be something that we can calculate somewhat easily because we know the number of trips, we know the number of segments, and we know the length of those segments. So for Dade County here, we may be able to, or for any of the counties, we could pull out what's the bike VMT and what's the bike ADT. Well, I mean, what's the bike VMT for that particular county for that time period?
Right now we compare county to county. You had this many crashes in the last year. But usually we have to then normalize that by population, and it's per 100,000 population in your county or something like this. It would be interesting if we could use STRAVA to begin to do that kind of county-to-county comparison for miles of bike trips or number of bike trips rather than just population. I think that would maybe give us a better. It'd be interesting to see if our picture changed in terms of our high priority, high crash county concentrations.
Great. Any other questions?
There are no other questions at the moment.
I appreciate it very much. This is Dennis, and it was very interesting. And I can see another component of collecting data for various crashes, and especially with bicycles and those that are pedestrians. This could be a useful tool. So I'm sure they'll be perfected more and more as you move forward using it. I guess Strava will too. Very interesting.
Well, and we encourage you to use it because it's helping us move forward with it. There's only so much we're going to be able to do with it here in the central office, and I think the real strength of this will come as folks outside Tallahassee begin to use it for real-world applications and what you're doing, and that will help us understand better the potential and limitations of this.
Right.
We encourage you to do that as much as you can.
Okay, appreciate it. With that, Anthony, is there anything else?
No, there's no other questions from the chat. We'll go ahead and end the recording, and we'll stay on the line for a few minutes in case anybody has anything else they want to add. Thank you so much. This was a good presentation.
Yeah, very good.
Thank you.